The rest of the day passed in a tense silence. Ryker had left me alone in the penthouse, giving me space to prepare, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was preparing for. My thoughts raced with every step, every move. I had no choice but to follow Ryker's lead. This was a world I didn't understand, but it was the world I now had to survive in. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted. Ryker reappeared, dressed in black, his presence filling the room as soon as he entered. He moved with purpose, no hint of hesitation in his steps. "It's time," he said, his voice low and decisive. He didn't need to explain further. I had known from the moment he mentioned the theater that the night would be critical. Tonight, everything would change. I followed him as he led me to the elevator, the cool, polished surface of the car surrounding us as we descended. The city outside was already alive with lights, a stark contrast to the darkened silence inside the penthouse. When the elevator doors opened, we were greeted by the cold night air, sharp and biting as it hit my skin. A sleek black SUV was waiting at the curb, the engine humming quietly. Ryker didn't look back as he got in, his hand resting casually on the door as I slid into the seat beside him. Kale and Alexei were already in the front, silent and vigilant. The drive to the Orpheum Theater was short but felt interminable. The streets blurred by, the city's usual pulse seeming distant as I sat in silence next to Ryker. He was focused, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the confines of the car. There was a tension in the air, something I couldn't name but felt deep in my bones. The theater loomed ahead as we arrived, a dark, imposing structure nestled among the city's older buildings. It looked like something out of a different time, its architecture worn, its history steeped in layers of forgotten stories. This was a place Ryker knew well, a place where the shadows held more secrets than the light ever would. We were ushered in through a side entrance, hidden from the public eye. As we entered the backstage area, I felt the weight of the building's age, its quiet murmurings as though the walls themselves had witnessed countless deals and whispered conversations. The air was thick with the scent of old velvet, dust, and something else I couldn't quite place, a sense of something about to unfold. Ryker led me through narrow hallways, his pace steady, every movement measured. We passed crew members setting up for the evening's performance, but none of them seemed to notice us, or at least, they pretended not to. We were invisible in a different way now, not in the sense that we blended in, but that we were part of the machinery of the night. We were ghosts, moving among the living. We reached the private box at the top of the theater, the one that overlooked the stage. From here, we could see everything. The lights were dim, and the audience was just beginning to filter in, their murmurs a low hum that blended with the soft music playing from the orchestra pit. Ryker stood still, surveying the room below. "Silas Hawke will be here," he said quietly. "He always comes when the chaos is thick enough to cover his tracks. He's here for the show, and so are we." I stood beside him, trying to keep my nerves in check. I had no idea what I was supposed to do, but I was beginning to understand that Ryker didn't need me to do anything other than observe. I had already played my part. Now, I was just waiting for the next move. "The performance is about to begin," Ryker said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Watch closely. Hawke will show himself soon enough." The theater darkened, and the stage lights flared to life. The audience settled into silence, the anticipation thick in the air. The performance started, but I wasn't watching it. I was watching the crowd, the movement of people, the way they shifted in their seats, their subtle glances toward the private boxes. I was watching for the man who had been haunting my thoughts for days, the man with the Hawke ring. It wasn't long before I spotted him. He was near the back of the theater, just behind the last row of seats. His posture was perfect, controlled, almost regal. He was dressed in a long coat, his hat low over his face. But I could see his hands clearly now, the same silver ring with the black stone, the Hawke etched into it. "There," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ryker's gaze shifted immediately, locking onto the man in the back. He didn't seem surprised, but his eyes were cold with intent. "We move now," he said, his voice low but commanding. Without another word, Ryker turned and made his way down the narrow corridor, his pace swift but calculated. Kale and Alexei flanked him, and I followed in their wake, trying to keep up but feeling the weight of every step. The plan had begun. And now, there was no turning back, the chase was on. We moved quickly, silently through the backstage corridors, blending into the shadows as the sounds of the performance echoed in the distance. The theater felt like a labyrinth, each turn and hallway a maze meant to keep secrets buried. I could hear my own breath, shallow and tight, but I forced myself to remain steady. Ryker led the way, his movements fluid and efficient. Kale and Alexei flanked him, their eyes scanning every corner, every door, every dark space. I tried to mirror their vigilance, but my mind was running a million miles a minute. Silas Hawke was here, somewhere in this theater, and he was the key to everything. We reached a narrow stairway that led up to the upper levels. The air felt colder here, and the silence was more oppressive, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Ryker's eyes were focused ahead, unblinking. There was no room for doubt, no room for hesitation. "Stay close," Ryker murmured, barely glancing back. "We're almost there." I nodded, my pulse racing. My heart was in my throat now. I wasn't sure what would happen next. Would we confront Hawke here? Would he make a move? And what role was I really playing in all of this? We emerged from the stairwell into another private section of the theater, a hallway lined with velvet curtains and ornate furniture that seemed untouched by time. The ambience was elegant, but there was a sinister edge to it now. The place felt alive with the potential for violence, the calm before the storm. At the end of the hallway, I could see a figure standing by the door of a private lounge. He was tall, his coat long and dark, his posture unmistakable. Silas Hawke, he was staring directly at us as if he had known we'd come. As if he had been waiting for this moment. Ryker didn't flinch, his expression unreadable. He moved forward with a calm confidence, and his men followed him without hesitation. I stayed a few steps behind, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. This was it. The moment everything changed. Hawke's eyes locked onto mine as we approached. There was a calculating glint in them, as if he was assessing me, weighing my value, just like Ryker had. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct told me to. "Ryker," Hawke said smoothly, his voice low, with a slight accent that I couldn't place. "I wasn't expecting company tonight." His eyes flicked briefly to me before returning to Ryker, and I saw the slightest smirk tug at the corner of his lips. Ryker's expression remained unchanged. "You knew I'd come. You always do." Hawke laughed softly, the sound cold, as though he found some kind of twisted humor in the situation. "Of course. You think I don't know when you're coming for me?" The tension in the air thickened. I felt like an outsider, caught between these two forces of nature. Ryker stood like a stone, unmovable, and Hawke like a predator, waiting for the first sign of weakness. "I know who you work for, Hawke," Ryker continued, his voice low and steady. "And I know why you're here. The question is, what do you want?" Hawke's smirk faded as his eyes narrowed. "You think you're in control of this, Ryker? You're just another piece in the game. The sooner you accept that, the better." The air grew colder. Ryker didn't flinch at the threat. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence imposing, as if he were daring Hawke to make a move. "The game is mine now," Ryker said, his voice carrying a quiet finality. "You can't change that. You're too late." For a moment, there was only silence between them, the weight of their words hanging in the air like a thick fog. I stood there, uncertain of what was happening, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, without warning, Hawke reached inside his coat and pulled out a small envelope. He tossed it onto the table between them, the gesture casual, as if it were just another part of their usual interaction. "This is your last warning, Ryker," Hawke said, his voice a low growl. "You don't control everything. You never have. And you won't." Ryker stared at the envelope, then back at Hawk, his gaze cold and unflinching. I don't need your warnings. Before anyone could move, a loud noise broke the silence, a sudden crash from down the hall. The tension in the room exploded into action. Get back. Ryker snapped, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the danger. Kale and Alexei moved immediately, guns drawn, scanning the area for any threats. Hawk didn't flinch at the chaos. He stood still, his eyes gleaming with something dark, anticipation, perhaps. You're already too late, Ryker. The noise continued, shuffling footsteps, muffled voices, but I couldn't focus on them. My entire being was focused on Ryker, his grip on me, the danger we were now surrounded by. We need to go, Ryker said, his voice tight. Now. As we moved back into the corridor, my heart raced with fear. We had come here to confront Hawk, to unravel the conspiracy, but now it was all slipping out of our control. The chase was no longer just about finding answers. It had become a battle for survival. And no one, least of all me, knew how it would end. The atmosphere had shifted, gone from tense to outright volatile. The crash from down the hall was followed by shouts, the sound of scuffling feet and chairs being knocked over. The theater, which had felt like a labyrinth just moments ago, now seemed like a cage, each hallway a trap closing in around us. Ryker's grip on my arm tightened as he pulled me further into the corridor, away from the chaos. Kale and Alexei were ahead, their eyes scanning the darkened passageways with the sharp focus of men who were no strangers to danger. They moved like ghosts, silent and deadly. What's happening? I whispered, trying to catch my breath as we moved swiftly down the hall. Ryker didn't answer immediately. His jaw was clenched, his eyes flicking to every corner as if he were measuring the distance to safety with every step. It's a diversion, he finally said, his voice low, controlled, but laced with urgency. Hawk knew we were coming. He's playing his hand, making sure we don't reach him before he has a chance to disappear. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Hawk's confidence had always felt like a trap, and now it was becoming clear that I had walked right into it. We reached the stairwell and descended quickly, my legs moving on autopilot as I tried to keep up with Ryker's long strides. The noise from above grew louder as we moved away from it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded in a direction we didn't want to go. Stay close, Ryker said, his voice sharp, though I didn't think it was directed at me. It was more of an order to the world, as if his words alone could make the chaos stop. We reached the back exit, a narrow door that led to an alley behind the theater. The cold air hit me like a slap as we stepped out into the night. The city was alive with the noise of traffic and distant sirens, but the alley was quiet, eerily so. Where's Hawk? I asked, my voice tight with worry. We had been so close, but now he was slipping through our fingers, disappearing into the shadows. Ryker stopped, his face expressionless as he surveyed the alley. He's already gone, he said quietly. This was never about finding him tonight. It was about seeing how far we'd go. I didn't understand. The tension in the air felt like it was building to something bigger than just one man evading capture. It was a message. I could feel it in the way Ryker held himself, in the weight of his words. We've been played, Ryker said under his breath, his eyes narrowing. Hawk set this up. He wanted us to chase him, to waste time. He knew we'd come. I took a step back, my head spinning. Why? Why would he lead us here if he knew we'd catch up to him? Ryker turned to face me, his gaze steady but tinged with something darker. Because he wanted to see how much we'd risk to get to him. And now we've shown our hand. A sudden thought hit me, sharp and uncomfortable. You're not just hunting Hawk, are you? I said quietly. You're hunting someone else. Someone behind him. Ryker didn't answer immediately, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. Hawk was just a pawn in a much larger game. The real target was someone deeper in the shadows, someone who had been pulling strings from behind the scenes. I swallowed hard, the weight of the realization sinking in. You're not going to stop until you find them, are you? Ryker's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening as he looked toward the end of the alley. No. I'm not stopping. And neither are you. The finality in his voice left no room for argument. The game had just escalated. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about a fight for power, for control, and for a future neither of us could predict. We stood in silence for a moment, the distant sounds of the city swirling around us, until Ryker turned and motioned for me to follow. We'll regroup, he said, his voice steady now, as though he had already moved on from the chaos of the night. There's more work to be done. I followed him, my mind racing with the implications of everything that had happened. I thought I understood Ryker's world, but I was only beginning to see just how deep it went. He had known more than I had realized. And now, I was caught in the middle of it all, a player in a game I hadn't chosen. As we walked back into the shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. And we were just getting started. We moved quickly through the darkened streets, Ryker's pace steady and unyielding. The night had fallen fully now, the city streets lit only by the occasional flicker of streetlights. The chaos of the theater seemed distant now, swallowed by the city's constant hum. But the tension between us remained thick, palpable, like the air before a storm. Ryker was silent, his face a mask of concentration. He hadn't looked at me since we left the alley, but I could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on me. Hawk had played us, that much was clear. But there was something else. Something bigger, hidden beneath the surface. Ryker had made a dangerous move tonight, and he was already calculating the next one. We reached a car waiting at the curb, sleek and black, its engine barely a whisper as Ryker opened the door and slid in. Kale and Alexei were already inside, their eyes scanning the street, alert, vigilant. As I climbed in after Ryker, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading toward something inevitable. Something that had been set in motion long before I had ever stepped into Ryker's world. Where are we going? I asked, my voice breaking the silence. The question had been hanging in the air, unspoken, since we left the theater. Ryker didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed ahead as the car pulled away from the curb. For a long moment, it seemed like he was deciding whether or not to share his plans. But then he spoke, his voice calm, measured. We're going to meet with someone, he said, his gaze still distant. Someone who can give us the answers we need. I raised an eyebrow, the uncertainty clear in my voice. Answers about what? He finally turned to look at me, his gaze piercing. About Hawk, about the man behind him, and about who's been pulling the strings. We've played enough games tonight. It's time for the next move. I leaned back in my seat, the weight of his words sinking in. This was bigger than I had imagined. The entire city seemed like a chessboard, with pieces moving in the shadows. Ryker wasn't just a player in this game, he was a force of nature, and I was tangled up in it, whether I wanted to be or not. The car moved swiftly through the city, the lights outside blurring as we passed. We turned down narrow streets, the buildings growing older and more worn with every turn. This wasn't a place for the faint of heart. It felt like we were descending into the heart of the city's underworld, a place where secrets were bought and sold, where power was measured by who controlled the shadows. We finally pulled up in front of a building that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Its windows were dark, its entrance narrow and unassuming. But there was an air of quiet authority to it, as though everything inside had been carefully calculated and controlled. We're here, Ryker said quietly, his voice a command. He didn't wait for anyone to respond, stepping out of the car with the same confidence that marked every one of his moves. I followed, my feet moving almost without thought as I stepped into the building's shadow. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old stone, the faint smell of something long forgotten. Inside, the building was dimly lit, the walls lined with bookshelves and old furniture. It was a place that had been frozen in time, a relic of a bygone era. At the far end of the room, a figure stood waiting. She was tall, her posture regal, her eyes sharp and calculating. Her presence filled the space, as though she were the true power here. She was dressed in black, her dark hair tied back in a sleek ponytail. "Ryker," she said, her voice cool and controlled. "I didn't expect you to show up tonight." Ryker didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering as he approached her. I stood back, watching as the tension between them crackled in the air. "This is Alara," Ryker said, his voice finally breaking the silence. "She's involved now." The woman's eyes flicked over to me, assessing, calculating. For a moment, I felt like I was being dissected, my every move, every gesture, weighed and measured. She nodded once, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. "I see," she said, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Welcome to the game, Alara." I swallowed, unsure of how to respond. The woman's gaze never wavered as she stepped closer to Ryker, her eyes sharp and knowing. She didn't need to say much. The weight of her presence alone spoke volumes. "So, what's the plan?" she asked, her voice low, controlled. Ryker didn't hesitate. "We find out who's behind all of this. We find out who's using Hawk, and we end this. Tonight." The woman nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I hope you're ready for the consequences of that, Ryker," she said, her eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "I'm always ready," Ryker replied, his voice cold and unwavering. "The question is, are you?" The air in the room shifted, charged with an intensity that was almost palpable. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on us all. This was more than just a confrontation, it was the beginning of something bigger, something that none of us could control. "Then let's begin," the woman said, her voice soft, but with an authority that brooked no argument. I felt the first true ripple of fear settle in my chest. We had crossed a line tonight, and there was no turning back. The game had changed, and we were about to find out just how deep the rabbit hole went. The woman led us down a narrow hallway at the back of the building, her footsteps silent on the old wooden floors. Ryker moved ahead, his presence so commanding that it felt like the very air parted to make room for him. I followed closely, my thoughts racing as we descended deeper into this forgotten place. The tension in the air had thickened since we entered. Every step seemed to echo through the halls, the quiet punctuated only by our footsteps and the occasional creak of the building settling. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking towards something far beyond a simple confrontation. It felt like we were heading straight into the heart of whatever monstrous thing lay behind all of this. The woman, who had yet to introduce herself, stopped at a door at the end of the corridor. It was plain, unassuming, but I could feel the weight of something hidden just beyond it. She turned to Ryker, her expression unreadable. "The man you're looking for is inside," she said quietly, her voice carrying a gravity that seemed to hang in the air. "But be careful. He's not someone you want to underestimate." Ryker's gaze was cold, calculating. "Underestimating him is not an option," he said, his voice steady, like a blade being sharpened for a kill. "I've waited too long for this." The woman stepped aside, gesturing toward the door with a slight nod. "After you." Without another word, Ryker pushed open the door, and I followed him into the room. The air inside was thick with the scent of old leather and cigar smoke. A large desk sat at the far end of the room, its surface cluttered with papers and maps, and what appeared to be a collection of old photographs pinned to the wall behind it. The room felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Sitting behind the desk was a man, older, but his eyes were sharp and alive with calculation. His face was weathered, the lines on his face carved deep by years of experience in this world. He didn't look surprised to see us. If anything, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it was quickly masked by indifference. "Ryker," the man said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "I didn't think you'd come for me personally." Ryker stepped forward, his movements precise and deliberate. "I don't take chances anymore," he said coldly. "I'm here to make sure the game ends tonight." The man smiled, a thin, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk in a rhythm that seemed almost like a signal, though to what, I couldn't tell. "I suppose I should be flattered," he said, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "You think you can just walk in here and take control of everything. But you're missing something, Ryker. You always have." Ryker's jaw clenched, but his expression remained unreadable. "We're done playing games," he said, his voice low, edged with a quiet fury. "Tell me who you're working for, and I might let you walk out of here." The man's gaze flicked over to me briefly, sizing me up before he leaned forward. "You don't know who you're dealing with, do you, Ryker?" His voice dropped to a whisper, but the words seemed to hang in the air like a heavy, ominous cloud. "This game isn't yours to end. You've been a pawn all along. Just like your father was." The mention of Ryker's father hit like a blow to the gut. I saw Ryker's expression shift, just for a split second, but it was enough for me to catch the flicker of something deep, something personal. The man behind the desk had struck a nerve. "Don't speak about my father," Ryker said, his voice dangerously low, like a warning just before a storm. "I'm not here to talk about the past. I'm here to make sure this ends, for good." The man chuckled, a dry, harsh sound that echoed in the otherwise silent room. "You're not in control, Ryker. You never were. And now you've brought her into this," he said, nodding toward me. "The girl who thinks she can play with the big boys. You're all tangled in the same web, whether you like it or not." I felt a chill run through me at his words. It was as if he could see right through me, right into my fears, my doubts. I wasn't just caught in this world by chance. I was in deeper than I realized. Ryker's eyes narrowed, his hand moving toward the gun holstered at his side, but the man behind the desk raised a hand, signaling for him to stop. "You want answers," he said, his voice almost pitying now. "I'll give them to you. But understand this, no one walks away from this unscathed. Not you. Not me. And certainly not her." I took a step back, my pulse racing. This was no longer just a game of power, it was a battle of survival. We were all connected now, in ways I hadn't fully understood until this moment. The man stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Ryker. "You've been chasing shadows, Ryker. And now the real player is about to make their move." There it was, the moment I had been dreading. The real enemy, the one pulling the strings, the one who had orchestrated everything from the beginning, was finally going to reveal themselves. I could feel the weight of the words in the room, and I knew that whatever came next would change everything. Ryker wasn't just fighting for control, he was fighting for survival. And so was I. The air in the room grew heavier as the man behind the desk straightened, his cold eyes locked on Ryker. His presence was suffocating, as though every word he spoke was carefully calculated to keep us on edge. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, each beat louder than the last. Ryker hadn't moved, his gaze fixed on the man, but the tension between them felt like a live wire, crackling, waiting for something to snap. "The real player?" Ryker repeated, his voice almost a growl. "Who the hell are you working for?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something darker, more dangerous. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low and mocking. "I'm not working for anyone. I am the game. And so are you." Ryker's fists clenched, but he didn't move to strike. He was waiting. Waiting for the man to say something that would give him the edge, something that would finally break the deadlock. I glanced between them, trying to piece it all together. Everything that had happened over the past few days, the chase, the games, the constant threat, it all seemed to converge in this moment. But I couldn't understand it. Who was the real enemy? And how was I tied into all of this? The man behind the desk chuckled, as if reading my thoughts. "You think it's just about Hawk, don't you? About some petty power grab? No. It's much bigger than that." Ryker took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the man. Then tell me, he demanded. Tell me what's really going on. The man's smile faded as he stepped away from the desk, moving with slow, deliberate steps toward the window. He pulled back the curtains just enough to look out at the city below. The glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across his face, making him look even more sinister. You've been playing right into my hands, he said, his voice almost casual now, like he was explaining something simple. Every move you've made has been exactly what I wanted. And you've been too blind to see it. I could feel the blood draining from my face. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of this room before the walls closed in. But Ryker wasn't moving. He was standing there, still focused, still listening. You wanted control, the man continued, turning back to face us. You wanted power, Ryker. You thought you could take my place. You thought you could win this war. But you were always just a pawn. Just like your father was. Ryker's face hardened, his expression betraying nothing, but I could feel the shift in the air. The man had hit a nerve enough with the games, Ryker said, his voice steady, but I could hear the cold edge beneath it. Tell me who you are. Who the hell are you really? The man's eyes glinted with something dark. Who am I? He repeated, his lips curling into a smile that sent a chill down my spine. You don't know, do you? All these years, you've been fighting for control of the city, thinking you could outsmart me. But I'm the one who's been controlling everything from the start. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. I could feel the tension in the room like a physical presence, pressing down on me. You've been chasing shadows, Ryker. Your father, Hawk, all of it. It's all just part of the game. And now you're about to realize who the real player is. My mind was racing, but I couldn't make sense of it. This was no longer just about Ryker and Hawk, it was something much bigger. Whoever this man was, he was the one pulling the strings, the one orchestrating everything. Who are you? I asked, the question escaping my lips before I could stop myself. My voice trembled, and I hated how weak it sounded, but I had to know. I had to understand what was going on. The man's smile widened. I am the one who controls everything you've seen, everything you think you understand. I am the one who owns the game, and now you're in it. Welcome to the real world, Alara. His words hit me like a blow to the chest. I stumbled back, the room spinning around me. This wasn't just a power struggle. It wasn't just about money or control. This was about something far more dangerous, something deeper than I had ever imagined. Ryker took a step toward the man, his eyes narrowing. You think you're untouchable, he said, his voice dangerously low. You think you can play me like a fool? The man didn't flinch. In fact, he seemed almost pleased by Ryker's anger. I don't need to touch you to win, Ryker, he said, his voice smooth and confident. I've already won. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I fought to keep my composure. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. What do you want? I asked, my voice shaky but determined. What's your endgame? The man's smile never faltered. My endgame, he repeated. I already told you. It's you. The weight of his words crashed down on me, and I felt a cold shiver run through my body. He wasn't just after Ryker. He was after all of us. And I was more involved in this than I ever could have imagined. Ryker stepped forward again, his eyes locking with the man's. You'll regret underestimating me, he said quietly, but there was a fire in his eyes that made the man pause. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, with a final, sharp smile, the man spoke again. We'll see about that, Ryker. And just like that, the moment of tension snapped. Ryker was about to make his move, but everything had changed. The game had just escalated, and the stakes were higher than either of us could have known. The silence between us stretched for what felt like an eternity. The man behind the desk, still standing with that chilling smile, was testing us, prodding us to see how far we'd go, how much we'd sacrifice to take control. The weight of his words lingered in the air like poison, twisting and turning in my mind. Ryker stood motionless, his jaw set, his eyes hard. His silence was a challenge, as though daring the man to make the next move. But I could feel the change in the room. We weren't in charge anymore. This man, whoever he was, had us cornered, and it was a power he was more than willing to flaunt. "You've said your piece," Ryker finally spoke, his voice a controlled growl, "but this ends tonight." The man's smile faltered for just a moment, the first crack in his otherwise perfect facade. But it was enough. Ryker had touched a nerve. "Oh, Ryker," the man said with a sigh, as if he were dealing with an annoying child. "You still don't understand, do you? You're in my game. I decide how this ends, not you. This isn't a battle of control anymore. This is survival." The words hung heavily in the room, thick with the implications of what he was saying. This was no longer just a power struggle. It was a fight for something deeper, something more dangerous than either of us had realized. The man slowly made his way to a shelf on the far side of the room, his footsteps deliberate, slow, as if he were savoring the moment. He pulled out a thick folder, its edges worn, and placed it carefully on the desk. Then he slid it toward us with a single motion, the silence almost unbearable in the wake of his calm. "You want to understand?" he asked, his voice almost bored now, as if he were indulging a child's curiosity. "Look inside. You'll see everything you need to know. Everything you've missed. Everything you think you know about the game is wrong." I felt my pulse quicken. This was it, the moment that would unravel everything. Ryker had been hunting answers, searching for control, but all of it had been leading to this moment. To this man, to the folder, to the truth hidden within. Ryker didn't hesitate. He opened the folder without a second thought, the sharp rustle of paper echoing in the room. His eyes scanned the pages, moving quickly from one document to the next. I leaned in, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever this man had in that folder, it was going to change everything. I caught a glimpse of the first page, a series of photos. People I didn't recognize. Documents with names and dates I couldn't decipher. But the weight of it was undeniable. This wasn't just information, it was a map, a blueprint of something far more dangerous than any of us had anticipated. Ryker's face was unreadable, but the tension in his posture told me everything I needed to know. The game was shifting again, and we weren't in control. "Not anymore, what is this?" I asked, unable to hold back my curiosity. The man behind the desk didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched us both carefully, as if waiting to see how we would react. "This is the truth," he said finally, his voice colder now. "This is who you're really fighting. The people behind the shadows, pulling the strings. Your father was just the beginning, Ryker. And now you're a part of something much larger than you ever realized." I felt a chill run down my spine. Ryker's father had been more than just a casualty of the game. He had been a part of something far darker, something that went deeper than power struggles and mafia wars. I looked at Ryker, who was still scanning the pages, his face now a mask of cold fury. His eyes locked on one page, and then, for the first time since we'd entered the room, his expression changed just slightly. There was something there, something in his gaze that shifted. "This is impossible," Ryker muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I knew he was involved in something big, but this, he stopped, unable to finish the thought. The man behind the desk watched him, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "Your father didn't just run a small-time operation, Ryker. He was a part of the foundation of everything you've been fighting against. The connections, the power, everything you've been chasing was orchestrated by people far beyond your reach." I didn't understand it all, but I could see the way Ryker's fists clenched, the way his entire body tensed. The world he had been trying to control, the empire he'd been fighting to build, was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. And that puzzle had been designed by people far more powerful than anyone could have guessed. Who are they? I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. Who are these people behind all of this? The man's lips curled into a smile again, but this time it was colder, more sinister. That's the real question, isn't it? He said, his voice a whisper of a threat. Who are the people who think they can control everything? Ryker slammed the folder shut, his anger radiating off him like a storm. Tell me what you know, and tell me now, he demanded. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step back and raised his hands, as if offering a challenge. I know everything, Ryker, he said calmly. I know what's coming next. And now, so do you. The finality in his words echoed through the room, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. Whatever came next, it was going to change everything. And we were standing right in the eye of the storm. The silence in the room was deafening. The man's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating the space between us. I could feel the pressure building, like a storm about to break. Ryker's jaw was clenched, his fists still tight at his sides. The man behind the desk had finally given us the one thing we had been searching for, the truth, but it came at a cost. What's coming next? Ryker's voice was low, controlled, but it carried a dangerous edge that made the man smile again. The man leaned back against his desk, his eyes glinting with something dark and knowing. It's not about what's coming, Ryker. It's about what's already here. The people you've been fighting? They're part of something much bigger than you ever thought. And they've been playing you this whole time. My heart skipped a beat at his words. I couldn't fully grasp the implications of what he was saying, but I could feel the weight of it, pressing down on me like a physical presence. Ryker stepped forward, closing the distance between him and the man behind the desk. Enough of the cryptic bullshit, he snapped. Tell me who these people are. Who's been controlling everything? Who's behind it all? The man's smile faltered for just a second, a brief flicker of something, fear, perhaps, before it was masked again with that cold, almost mocking demeanor. You want names? You want to know who's pulling the strings? He asked, as if he were amused by the desperation in Ryker's voice. You've already met them. You just didn't know it. I could feel the tension in the air as Ryker turned his head to glance at me. His expression was unreadable, but I knew he was grappling with the same thought I had. The pieces of this puzzle were right in front of us, but they didn't fit together. The man behind the desk took a step closer, as if sensing our confusion. You've seen the people who've been controlling everything. The man you thought you could eliminate, Hawk, he's a part of a much larger network. The people behind him? They've been in the shadows the whole time. People like your father. Ryker froze, his face tight with anger. My father, he repeated, his voice low and sharp. Don't speak of him again. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded as though he understood the depth of the pain his words caused. Your father was never just a businessman, Ryker. He was part of an operation that stretches far beyond the city. He was a key player. And now, it's your turn. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was spinning with these revelations. Everything we had fought for, everything we had sacrificed, was beginning to unravel before my eyes. Who are they? I finally demanded, my voice more forceful than I had intended. Who are these people, and why does Ryker have to be part of their game? The man smiled again, this time with more satisfaction than before. He seemed to enjoy watching us struggle to piece it all together. The real players don't show themselves. They don't need to. They work through people like Hawk, like your father, like me. He gestured to himself, a subtle hint of arrogance in his voice. And now, Ryker, you're the one who'll have to decide how to play the next hand. You'll either join them, or you'll fall. I was about to ask another question when Ryker suddenly moved, his body tense, his fists clenched at his sides. His voice was low, filled with an edge I hadn't heard before. I won't join them, he said, his words like a vow. I'll burn this whole thing down if I have to. You, Hawk, anyone who thinks they can control me. The man didn't flinch at Ryker's threat. He simply raised his hands, as though conceding the point. That's your choice, Ryker. But don't fool yourself into thinking you're in control anymore. You've crossed a line. You can't go back from this. Ryker's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He was teetering on the edge, caught between his desire for power and the reality of the forces he was up against. So what happens now? He asked, his voice dangerously calm. The man's smile returned, more like a predator sizing up its prey. Now we see who survives. Who can take control of what's left. But make no mistake, Ryker. You're in the game whether you like it or not. And the consequences for losing are irreversible. I could feel the weight of his words, the unspoken threat in the air. Ryker wasn't just battling for control of the city anymore. He was fighting for survival. And I was in the middle of it all, dragged into this game by forces much bigger than I could have ever imagined. Ryker didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned, his eyes dark with determination. Then let the game begin. The man behind the desk chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Oh, it already has, Ryker. It already has. The room seemed to close in around us as the weight of those words settled in. We had walked into something far darker than either of us had anticipated. And now, there was no escape from the consequences of our choices. I glanced at Ryker, seeing the fire in his eyes, the unyielding resolve that had gotten him this far. But I also saw the weariness beneath it. This game wasn't one he could win alone. We were both trapped in it now. We're not done yet, Ryker said quietly, his voice carrying a note of finality. Not by a long shot. We stood there for a long moment, the silence in the room thick with unspoken tension. The man behind the desk seemed to take pleasure in the weight of the situation, his cold smile never faltering. But there was something else beneath it, a quiet satisfaction, as though he had just watched us walk right into his trap and was savoring the moment. Ryker's gaze didn't leave him, but I could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. He was calculating his next move, and I knew better than to interrupt. We were on the brink of something dangerous, something that could alter everything. The man behind the desk had given us pieces of the puzzle, but the picture still wasn't clear. And with every answer we got, the game only became more complicated. Finally, Ryker broke the silence. You've made your point, he said, his voice low but sharp. Now, I want you to answer me clearly, who are the people behind all of this? Who's really in charge? The man's smile twisted into something more knowing, almost smug. He wasn't afraid, and I could see the glint of excitement in his eyes as he leaned back against his desk. You really think I'm going to tell you that? He asked, his voice tinged with amusement. You're in this too deep now, Ryker. You think you're the one pulling the strings, but you're just another player on the board. A useful one, for a time, but nothing more. Ryker's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. The man was right, Ryker had been a pawn in someone else's game all along. I could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface, but Ryker wasn't about to give this man the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. You're wrong, Ryker said quietly, his tone colder than before. I'm done being a pawn. If I have to burn this entire game down, I will. And when the dust settles, I'll be the one standing at the top. Not you. Not anyone else. The man's smile faltered for just a second, but it quickly returned. You're a fool if you think that's how this works, Ryker. The people I'm working with, they don't play by the same rules you do. They don't make deals. They don't negotiate. They take. And if you stand in their way, you'll be erased without a second thought. The air grew thick with the weight of his words. I could feel the danger in the room, and it wasn't just the man behind the desk. There were bigger forces at play now. Ryker wasn't just fighting for control of the city, he was fighting for his life. Ryker took a slow, deliberate step forward. I don't care who they are. I don't care how powerful they are. They're not untouchable. And neither are you. The man looked at him, the amusement never leaving his face. You think you can stop them? You think you can change the game at this point? You're already too deep in. You'll never be able to pull yourself out. Ryker's eyes burned with intensity. I've been in worse situations than this. And I've always come out on top. I'll figure it out. I'll tear this whole system apart if I have to. But you're right about one thing, you're not untouchable. And neither are the people you're working for. The man seemed to weigh his words carefully before speaking again. I'll let you in on one secret, Ryker, he said, his tone suddenly more serious. You're not as clever as you think. This is bigger than you. Bigger than your father ever was. The people who control everything, they don't care about power or money. They care about control. And you're just another piece in their game. Ryker didn't react. He stood there, unwavering, his eyes locked on the man. But I could see the gears turning in his mind. The puzzle pieces were starting to come together, slowly but surely. The man behind the desk leaned forward, his expression taking on a darker edge. You want names? He asked, his voice a whisper. I'll give you one. But it won't be enough. The person you need to worry about isn't me. It's someone much closer to you. Ryker's gaze never wavered. Who? He asked, his voice as cold as ice, the man's lips curled into a smile. Someone you trust. The words hung in the air like a threat, but there was something else in the man's eyes, something almost triumphant. Ryker's face remained unreadable, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the subtle shift in his posture. This was a moment of realization. You're not talking about Hawk, Ryker said, his voice quiet, almost as if he were thinking aloud. You're talking about someone in my inner circle. Someone close to me. The man didn't answer, but the look in his eyes confirmed it. Who? Ryker repeated, his voice now edged with something dangerous. Who's been playing me this whole time? The man stood up from behind the desk and took a slow step toward Ryker. His eyes never left him as he spoke, his words like poison. The answer is right in front of you, Ryker. It's always been right there. All you have to do is look. The people who control everything, they don't need to hide anymore. They've already won.